As smallholder and subsistence farmers suffer impacts of climate change that are hard to predict. That will reduce, and what will reduce rather, the complexity both of the impacts and subsequent adaptations. Joining us live for this conversation is Adam Samenya, a climate expert, as well as the head of commercial arts, Tema Bio. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you, Purity.
Yes, and we're having this conversation ahead of the Africa Climate Week, which will be hosted right here in Nairobi. Some of the conversations that will be taking place are not new at all. We are looking at energy systems, for example, and how cities and urbanization are really leading to this. But we want to narrow this down to farming, how farming really contributes to climate change, because this is seen as a game changer in tackling climate change, and so we are not so much aware, people are not so much aware on how this can contribute to this. So when you talk about farming and climate change, what are some of the conversations that you look forward to having? Because I haven't seen that on the top 4 agenda for the African Climate Week.
Thank you very much, Purity, for having me. And I guess before I start, let me tell you what we do at Tema Bio.
Okay.
So we are a social enterprise set up about 12 years ago with presence in 4 continents now. In terms of countries, we're in over 35 countries. You'll find our technology in at least 35 countries in the world. Now, our objectives pretty much mirror similar to what the Africa Climate Summit aims to achieve. One of them being climate change, of course. Secondly, we are trying to elevate poverty, especially across the smallholder fraternity, smallholder farming fraternity, and also to improve livelihoods through improvement of people's pockets, long story short. So we have a technology that targets the smallholder farm that enables them to convert their waste into energy. And so that's what we do.
All right, and we shall be getting deeper into that conversation on biogas later on. But let's talk about what will be happening, like the key issues that have been fronted at the African African Climate Week rather. We've seen part of the agenda being on the energy systems, and the 4 issues here point to the reduction of the carbon emissions globally. And also in Africa. So let's begin at that point. Why is this conversation important? And I'm talking about reduction of carbon emission. What does it do to the climate, to the environment?
Thank you very much. So GHGs, the greenhouse gas emissions, impact our world. That 75% of global farming community is made up of the smallholder farms. That simply means that a lot of us are doing degenerative agricultural practices, and that needs to change, and change drastically. So this summit, one of the objectives, as you clearly spelled out, is meant to sensitize, to educate, to get all the players, both small and big, to work towards the common goal, which would be to reduce GHGs, which have a huge impact on the global climate, and by extension, on our agriculture. So it is timely, and we believe there'll be a lot of successes at the end of this summit, and we are looking forward to participating actively.
Absolutely. So let's talk about whether there are any strides that have been made, especially in the continent, because we have these summits and conferences every single year. In November, we'll be looking forward to also having the COP28, and discussions are just the same. Would you say as a continent there are strides that we have made in reducing the gas emission?
Absolutely. And the fact that the government is championing and leading the conversations from next week is a pointer in the right direction. Previously, it's been left to the private sector to engage and to try within their means, using their own capital, to access farmers, to educate them, to build capacity towards the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices or climate smart agriculture. Now that governments are involved, it's a positive thing, and Kenya is leading in that front. And obviously a few other African countries are also supporting this current initiative. So we are really, really happy that it's happening. Just like you said, lots of conferences, a lot of talk, and no action. Not this time. There's a lot of actionable points that come out of, we expect to come out of these. We've already pre-engaged even before the summit.
Right.
And we have different people championing different topics, and there are stakeholders with a lot at stake, so to speak. That's cliche, but there's a lot at stake for the different stakeholders that are going to be involved. So we look forward to some positive impacts after this climate summit.
And last year, when the African continent was moving, governments, especially leaders, were moving to Egypt for COP27. They fronted one agenda on financing. But when you look at these issues, discussing things to do with energy systems and, the countries that are really responsible, so to speak, in a meeting, a lot of gas, especially carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, being urged to really contribute financially to supporting the African countries which are suffering from their actions. But this time round, this conversation is not among the big four agenda for this conference. Probably is it something that can only be fronted at a global level, but when it comes to the African continent, what will they utilize to really achieve what they're looking forward to achieving?
Actually, listening to you talk, I think what we've noticed, especially in the last 5 years, is the level of investment on the African continent to support the adoption of climate smart technologies. Now, the fact that we are not reporting tangible results is probably doing us a bit of injustice, but I would say from where I sit and from where our social enterprise sits, there's a lot of strides we have made. For instance, in terms of numbers, we can confidently say that we have contributed to at least 1% reduction of GHGs in Kenya. That is one of those milestones that we have. And we want to achieve, as a global organization, 1% of global GHGs by 2030. So there's a lot of improvement going on that has happened. And in my opinion, the next thing that needs to happen is this communication, the education, the capacity building needs to be expanded. And that's where we need the involvement or inclusion of all the stakeholders, from the guys who create the awareness, to the guys who provide the technology, to the guys who reward the technology, to the guys who, basically scale this whole agenda of climate smart agriculture.
Right. And we've had a lot of conversations, like we've seen increased conversations regarding climate action. So we can say that there is some level of awareness as far as addressing climate change is concerned. But the elephant in the room most of the time, especially for the continent, is the cost of the transition. For instance, telling a Kenyan, for instance, to transition from use of solar systems. It's very expensive to install the solar panels. What should the government do to ensure, to support households and communities so that there is no question of it's expensive versus, because using fossil fuel seem to be cheaper versus adoption of the clean energy? What ought to be done? So
to tackle that, I'll go back a little bit. So one of the blockers or barriers to achieving that is capital or finance. A lot of people love or want to adopt clean energy, but they cannot afford it. So what options are available? They pretty much need to walk to a bank, a microfinance institution, or come to us, those of us who can finance, to help them do that. Now, what can the government do? In my opinion, the framework, the business framework that would motivate or, for lack of a better word, market agricultural finance, so that institutions are able to provide products or services to farmers at affordable rates. I think for me that's the winner. That interest rates could be lowered for agricultural products and services. That would be a starting point. Right now the market has very few players who have the right sized or rightly structured product that supports farmers in terms of them acquiring the right technology and for them to also implement the right agricultural practices. And for the purposes of awareness, creating awareness, let's look at the 4 areas, especially the 3 areas, main areas during the African Climate Week. We're looking at
emphasis. There will be emphasis on how urbanization is contributing to climate change, as well as land and ocean, the activities happening right there. So let's talk about that. We know the clean energy we ought to use, but what does urbanization present as far as climate change is concerned?
Good question.
Yeah.
So it all boils down to how we use the little land that we have.
Yeah.
It's all about how we do what we do in a sustainable, in a clean manner that eventually does not impact our climate negatively. Mm-hmm. Now, urbanization comes with a lot of things, such as industrialization. Industrialization comes with emissions. And clearly emissions impact the air we breathe. It impacts a lot of things, the climate, long story short. Yeah. So that the whole carbon emissions conversation is happening right now is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Governments need to rein in on the big players especially. I will come to the small players, but the big players need to be held accountable in as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions through adopting what I would call clean manufacturing processes or utilizing renewable energy, for instance. The other day the country was plunged into a blackout. If people had their own other sources of energy in terms of electricity, then that would not disrupt life. So urbanization has its ills. It's a good thing, but from an environmental preservation perspective, there are downsides. And that is a big conversation that is happening and will continue to happen. And especially regarding the big hitters in as far as carbon emissions are concerned.
Yeah, and you talk about the big hitters. I believe that Africa is the leader in addressing climate change because Africa, the continent, is the least emitter of carbon dioxide, which is the biggest contributor to global warming. So how can Africa take its position as a leader into addressing climate change?
We could do two things, from a macro level and from a micro level. Mm-hmm. I would say from a macro level, governments need to be strong, vocal, and supportive in terms of the infrastructural support, financing support, like I mentioned earlier on, from an awareness side of things, because it starts with kids adopt habits early on in life. Mm-hmm. Say our education system, for argument's sake, could be designed and be loaded with environmental awareness subjects or topics or studies. Right. So kids grow up knowing that you don't need to do little things like litter. You need to, look for renewable or cleaner ways of doing things. So it starts at an early age. Mm-hmm. That's on the micro level, the part that the governments need to play. Yeah. So there is awareness, there's promotion, there is enabling, there is of course, education, in all that. Mm-hmm. Now, at the micro level, 75% of our farmers are smallholder farms. Right. We all live in little shambas here and there. There are what I would call daily and productive degenerative practices that we deploy every single day. Right. It starts with where we store our waste. Mm-hmm. It starts with where we get our firewood to cook from, using charcoal. All this comes from deforestation. Right. And in my opinion, there is awareness. Farmers to a large extent understand
but is there enough support in terms of alternative on what they can use to go on with their farming activities?
So the support is coming from social enterprises like us. Yes. We are not that many. Yeah. We could still do with probably 10, 20 more people like us in this market. But to scale this whole change in terms of agricultural practices, we will need more investment. Mm-hmm. We will need to... Investment leads to scale. Scale means quick adoption. Right. And a few countries are ahead of others. Kenya is way ahead of other countries in Africa. Others need to play catch up, because that's the thing. Mm-hmm. And internally, as Systema Bio, we are actually expanding our tentacles into the region. We have quite a number of programs. I would say carbon programs as well, like in Uganda, we've had in Rwanda, in Malawi now, that are targeting quite a number of so many farmers who will quickly adopt this technology and help reduce carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases as well.
Yeah. And as we wrap it up, so what are the possible solutions to successfully transitioning to clean energy, whether in an urban setup or even for a smallholder farmer?
I would say capacity building, number one. So this message needs to go out, like en masse. Everybody needs to know that any degenerative practices are a thing of the past and that they need to quickly change.
Right.
So we need the system of bio, we are doing it. We need the government, we need all the players involved, including, like I mentioned, at the tertiary, at the very lowest level. Adoption at the, when you're born, you grow up knowing the do's and the don'ts in as far as keeping the environment clean and healthy is concerned, and all the way. So there's education, there's awareness, there's adoption, which means acquisition, and acquisition enablers will be financiers that would support this agenda. And yes, Africa Climate Summit is a right direction. So we need to have not Africa alone, but probably world summits or local, county summits that continue to talk about this. That it becomes the norm. Pretty much.
Thank you so much, Adam Samenya, current head of Commercial Arts System Bio. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you, Verity, and thank you for having me.
Okay, time for us to take a quick breather, but don't go too far. We still have more news lined up for you. Stay with us.